Welcome to Secret Affairs. In today's video, I'm taking you into a night that taught me something unusual about memories, specifically, the kind of memory that doesn't belong to people but to places. Some houses don't just hold families, they hold echoes. They preserve the quiet moments no one sees, the thoughts that never become words, the steps that become part of the floorboards, and the laughter that soaks into the walls. Most of the time, you walk straight through that history without realizing you're brushing up against old stories. But every once in a while, a place reveals just enough of what it remembers to remind you that we're never alone in the timeline we think we live in. And this winter night was one of those moments. The night we arrived, the snowfall didn't feel like the usual soft flurries drifting from the sky. It fell in slow spirals, as if the air itself was suspended, holding its breath. The quiet around us had a weight that didn't belong to weather alone. It felt like the whole forest, the whole landscape, and the house at the end of the path were all paused in the same moment, watching us. Our boots crunched on the frozen ground, echoing far louder than the distance justified. I remember thinking how strange it was that the sound bounced back from the trees in irregular patterns, almost like the forest was answering our footsteps instead of absorbing them. When we pushed open the front door, warmth embraced us immediately. Not just heat, but something like familiarity. Something lived in and layered. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace. Pine logs popped and sparked, filling the room with that deep winter scent that only comes from wood freshly split. Cinnamon lingered faintly. My wife had simmered it earlier while making dessert tanned. It mingled with the smell of old timber, the kind that has soaked in decades of seasons. My mother-in-law stood near the fire, the glow outlining her calm posture. At 49, she carried herself with a quiet strength that drew attention without ever demanding it. She had the kind of presence that made a room feel steadier the moment she walked into it. We exchanged greetings, shrugged off our coats, and melted into the comforting chaos of a family winter night. Laughter from the children, the clatter of dishes as my wife and sister-in-law arranged the table, an old playlist humming through the living room. Everything was familiar. And yet, beneath all the warmth and activity, something in the atmosphere felt charged. The house felt aware. I found myself glancing at corners, listening to the way the floorboards responded under my feet, watching how shadows stretched across the walls. Not out of fear, just curiosity, as if the place was paying attention. The hours passed easily with stories, food, and music. But every now and then, I caught my mother-in-law pausing, gazing at the fire or out the window, as though she was hearing something in the silence the rest of us weren't tuned into. I didn't question it. She had grown up in this house. Perhaps she understood its moods better than any of us. Everything felt normal until her voice called from the back of the house a little later. The sauna chimneys clogged again. Anyone brave enough to help before midnight? It was a simple request, but the way her voice traveled through the hallways made something in me stir. The echo felt fuller than it should have been, almost as if another layer of the house repeated her words under its breath. I volunteered, and my brother-in-law followed. She met us at the back door with a worn metal keytha, one that opened the basement where old tools were kept. The key was cold, slightly bent, and looked older than any of us. "This key will outlive the house," she said with a soft laugh, and we stepped into the biting wind. The yard was still, the trees standing like tall, quiet figures watching from the edges. The basement was at the back of the smaller wooden building behind the house. When we stepped inside, darkness swallowed the light of our flashlights for a moment before revealing shelves lined with forgotten objects. Boxes sagging under the weight of years, and tools that looked like they hadn't been touched in a decade. The air was cold in a different way than outside, denser, unmoving, almost as if the room was holding its breath. "Wait here," my mother-in-law said as she walked deeper into the shadows. "I'll find the brush." Her steps softened as she moved farther into the room. My brother-in-law nudged me with an elbow and whispered, "Basements never feel like part of the house. They feel like something else entirely." I nodded. "Separate," I said. He laughed. "Separate is too gentle." His joke was lighthearted, but he wasn't wrong. Some basements feel like memories that never learned how to fade. This one felt like that cowing, layered, saturated with the weight of time. We stood in silence for a moment, listening to the faint sounds of rummaging from somewhere behind old furniture and stacked crates. Then my mother-in-law's voice floated through the dark. This place hasn't changed in decades. Every time I come down here, it feels like the house is hiding something. Her tone was surprisingly calm, almost reflective. I was about to respond when an abrupt sound cut through the stillness, the sharp crack of old wood giving way. She stumbled. I reacted without thinking, reaching out and catching her by the arm before she fell. For one frozen second, everything around us went silent. Not the normal silence of a paused moment, but a full, unnatural suspension of sound. As if the room itself had stopped to observe. She looked at me and gave a breathless smile. "Thank you." Seems the house wanted to test our reflexes. But her eyes drifted behind me toward the far corner of the basement, scanning the shadows with the familiarity of someone who'd felt a presence before. Trying to diffuse the tension, my brother-in-law clapped his hands loudly. "All right, let's lighten the mood. Riddle time." His enthusiasm felt like an attempt to push back against the heaviness that had settled in the room. We laughed, the sound bouncing off the stone walls only. The echo didn't return quite right. It came back delayed, as if it had traveled a longer distance than it should have. And it was softer, thinner, as though something else had laughed after us, just a fraction of a second behind. We all heard it. My mother-in-law brushed cobwebs from a box and said, "This basement always did have a personality." She said it plainly, without fear, like she'd made peace with the strangeness long ago. When the lights finally flickered on with the buzzing hum of an old bulb, the room looked normal again, or as normal as a room full of decades of stored memories could look. The shadows still stretched in odd directions, but none of us mentioned it. Some things are easier to ignore. We finally found the chimney brush. Clearing the blockage on the sauna took only a few minutes. Steam hissed through the pipes, and warmth returned to the little wood-heated room. With the task complete, everything suddenly felt lighter. The ordinary rhythm of work has a way of pulling you back into the present. Part 3, across the yard. My wife's voice rang out cheerfully. "Come inside. Food's getting cold." The shift from the basement's strange quiet to the warmth of the house was like stepping from one world into another. Inside, everything felt alive again, people talking. Kids laughing, dishes clattering, the hum of music returning like a heartbeat. It grounded me. My mother-in-law sat at the head of the table, smiling gently, hosting effortlessly. Whatever she'd felt in the basement stayed behind in the shadows. Midnight approached with noise and celebration. The countdown rang out over the sound of fireworks exploding outside. Colors lit up the sky, dancing over the snow. Inside, the candles flickered with each burst of wind against the windows, casting moving shadows across the walls. I noticed things, teeny movements of light. The rhythm of the old clock ticking slightly off from the seconds. The way the curtains swayed even when the air was still, but I didn't dwell on them. Not tonight. By 3 in the morning, the house had settled. The awake ones drifted off to bed one by one. The fire in the living room had burned low, leaving only glowing embers. I walked in quietly, taking in the calm. My mother-in-law stood near the window, her silhouette outlined in the reflection of moonlight on snow. She was still contemplative, as though listening to something I couldn't hear. She didn't turn when I entered, not at first. I stood behind her quietly, not wanting to disturb the moment. When she finally looked toward the window, she caught my reflection. Her eyes met mine in the glass. She didn't speak. She simply offered a small, knowing smile. Not mysterious, not suggestive, just understanding. A silent acknowledgement of what we both felt earlier. The house had a presence, a memory, an awareness, and sometimes it decided to remind us. She turned and walked down the hallway, disappearing into the dim light without a sound. I stayed there for a while, watching the snow outside, listening to the old house as it settled. The creaks weren't strange anymore. The silence wasn't heavy. Everything felt like it belonged exactly where it was, like the house had finally exhaled. Morning brought ordinary life roaring back. Sunlight streamed through the windows. Smell of coffee filled the air. Children argued playfully over cereal. The night's atmosphere felt distant, almost unreal. Nothing seemed out of place. But the memory stayed with me not as fear, not as confusion, but as clarity. There are moments when places reveal a little bit of their history, not through ghosts or sounds or shadows, but through feelings. It's a kind of intuition that brushes against your awareness, reminding you that you're standing in the middle of stories that existed long before you arrived and will continue long after you leave. Every year, when New Year's Eve returns and the snow begins to fall in slow spirals, I think back to that night. The basement, the echo, the moment of silence that felt like the house was holding its breath. And the reflection in the window where two people shared an understanding of something they couldn't quite name. I don't think of it as supernatural. I think of it as a reminder that places remember us. They hold traces of who we were, even when we've forgotten. Some houses listen. Some houses carry the weight of time. Sometimes, on a quiet winter night, they let you feel what they remember.